Thick fog wrapped around the barracks gate, where Noah, a boy with eyes far older than his years, fingers tightly entwined with Grace's, stood like a reminder sent by fate. Ethan Moore, who once swore the war had stripped him of all feeling, felt a chill as Noah quietly placed a scorched photograph in his hand, stirring the memory of a home he had burned to ashes in his mind. In the boy's gaze, Ethan recognized a secret, a flame that would either lead him back or consume him entirely. The night wind moved across the flat ground like an old animal that knew its way, slipping through each gap in the wire, carrying the smell of dry sand and metal. Out by the side gate, the front yard of the base looked like a silver plate set down in the desert, throwing a pale yellow light just far enough before swallowing everything back into darkness. Ethan Cole stood under the low awning, hands laced inside worn gloves, listening to each shift of the wind against the flagpole, like a spoon tapping the rim of a cup. It was late. The last watch always felt longer than the others, not because the clock slowed down, but because the things in your head refused to go to sleep. Off to the left, the water pump gave a tired creak like an old chair. On the ledge sat a thick notebook where, every night, he wrote just enough to remind himself he was still here, still breathing. He'd been back in the country almost a year, but on nights like this, the whole desert felt like a strange map, and he was just a dot with no idea where it belonged. Coming home wasn't the same as being back. Some nights, he felt like a tenant in his own body, borrowing his hands to hold a flashlight, his eyes to watch the gate, his heartbeat just to know he was still alive. The sky was clear, but the stars weren't sharp, just scattered, like someone had shaken salt over it. In the distance, the black shapes of the mountains sank into the horizon, the deep violet making the night feel heavier. He could hear the scrape of his boots on the cement, a small, honest sound. Every time his weight shifted from heel to toe, he thought about the old wooden steps in a western town where he once had a house, and someone waiting for the kitchen light to come on. Back then, the willow tree out front cast long shadows across the road, and the water in the pipes sang like a voice. All that season was now just a key in his coat pocket, a key for a lock that had long been changed. He touched it out of habit, then pulled his hand away like someone had caught him. 3 knocks at the gate. Not loud, not hurried, clear, slow, like someone tapping the table before saying something hard. Ethan lifted his head. His ears, so used to meaningless noise, caught the strangeness in it right away. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a drunk soldier coming in late. It felt like someone had picked the right place, the right time, and found just enough courage not to shake. He set the notebook down, reached for the flashlight, and walked toward the viewing slot. On that short walk, he felt his back straighten a little more than usual, like his spine had just remembered it had a job to do. The overhead lights spilled thin sheets of brightness, catching each grain of sand as it floated by, each one flashing for half a second before vanishing. When he reached the spot, he didn't look right away. He took a long breath, listening for anything beyond those 3 knocks, a far-off engine, a metal door rattling in the wind, a stubborn cricket refusing to quit. No clear threat, but the night had its own way of keeping secrets. He pressed his eye to the slot. On the other side, the shadow of the main gate rose like the back of an old animal. Just in front of it stood a small figure, upright and still. From that distance, he could only make out the outline, a child's shape blending into the dark like a drop of ink. No ruse, no signal, just standing there like someone waiting for the bus in a small town before dawn. Head tilted down a bit, shoulders neat, all their weight settled into their feet. Ethan didn't open the gate right away. He swung the flashlight in a short arc across the frame, checking the hinges, the blind corners, the stretch of wall that always through the deepest shadows. Experience taught him not to trust a single shape in the dark. The beam sliced through, finding no other eyes, no make-believe gun barrels. Just dust, catching the light for a moment before letting it drift on. He lowered the light, feeling his heartbeat settle, neither quick nor slow. His left hand rested on the lock, lever the way an old mechanic might touch a machine he's worked on his whole life. And in that moment, he thought about other doors he'd opened. The hospital door that one last time, where a breath faded away. The door of the old house on moving day, where the hinge moaned like it was grieving. The plain door when he came home, with nobody waiting on the other side. Every door had taught him the same thing. Some things are gone for good, but you still have to open up because on the other side, there might be something that needs you right now, even if it's only light. He tapped back 3 times on the steel, a wordless way of saying, "I hear you." The small figure didn't answer, just lifted their head a little, like they'd been given permission to take a deeper breath. The wind shifted, bringing a far-off smell of something burned mixed with a warm rubber scent of pavement that had soaked up the day's sun. The mix made the back of his neck prickle, memories pulling through like a rope. Tents, oil stoves, sleepless nights, fingers coated in dust. But this wasn't that place. This was the American desert, only different in that it knew how to keep its mouth shut. Ethan's eyes flicked to the camera mounted on the gate's corner. The indicator light still blinked steady. He found himself trusting the smallest things: a bulb that hadn't burned out yet, a screw that hadn't loosened, a current running unbroken through the night. Sometimes that's all a man's got in him to believe in. In the guard cabin, the glow-in-the-dark hands of the clock showed just before 2 a.m. The two trembled slightly each time the wind nudged the wall, like time itself was breathing with the weather. Ethan thought about the numbers that had passed through his life. 2 years away from home, 8 months since he'd signed the transfer papers to this base. 2 days since he'd stopped touching the little wooden box with that handwritten note clipped inside. Numbers don't really say much, but standing in front of the gate like this, he could feel them lining up quietly. He tried out a line in his head, not for whoever was on the other side, but for himself. Still here. Still a gate. Still a watch. Still a job to do. Still steps that lead to where he's supposed to stand. The words moved from his chest to his throat, then stayed there, unspoken. That was enough. Grown men don't need to say everything out loud. In that measured silence, he noticed the small figure draw their arms in, holding something close to their chest. Not a backpack, not a package. Something soft, enough to make the body curl around it in protection. Even without a clear view, he knew that kind of hold. The way someone keeps a living thing safe through a long night. A thin thought, light as a hair, passed through him. They're carrying a tomorrow. The thought warmed his throat, like taking a sip of water after hours of talking only to yourself. He leaned his ear closer to the steel door. The wind on the other side had softened, sounding more like wool brushing skin. Another sound blended in, faint, maybe breathing. Not rushed, not crying, just the way a tired body counts down the seconds through its chest. He placed his right hand on the door, the cold coming through the glove in a way that felt good. Cold told him he was holding on to something real. In a moment before deciding what to do next, Ethan looked around one more time. The sand strip along the fence, the brick wall with a patch of chip paint shaped like a bird, the leaning light pole like a neck caught mid-nap. Funny thing was, those little details made him feel less adrift. Home, for some folks, doesn't have an address anymore. It's just a collection of things that stayed with you over the years. A strip of paint, the hum of a pump, the smell of dust after the season's first rain. Tonight, his home was this low awning, that pale yellow light, and the 3 knocks he'd just heard. He turned halfway, reached out, and flipped the intercom switch. The green light was enough to say the line was still open. His thumb touched the button, then pulled back. Not out of fear, and not to keep the credit for himself. Just because some things, if you call them in too soon, the crowd will show up right alongside suspicion. And suspicion breaks what's fragile. The night needs one person to stand still before it will let anyone else step in. And that kid out there, standing straight in the wind, seemed to believe the same thing. He bent down and pulled the key ring from the wall cabinet. Each key made a small click against the others, like raindrops hitting the bottom of a metal pan. He noticed the gate key was worn a bit at the tip, the edge catching the light in a thin white line. He held it up to eye level, like a silent ritual, then closed it into his palm. His other hand dropped the flashlight beam to the ground, tracing a narrow path of nothing but cement and sand. Ethan walked up close enough to hear the fabric of the gate cover shift against the steel in the wind. Through the slot, his eyes found that small shadow again. Still standing, still holding whatever it was, body curved to guard it. No eyes looking back at him. The distance and darkness swallowed those details. But he could feel them just the same. Eyes waiting for an answer, not in words, but in the sight of a door beginning to move. He set his thumb in the groove of the lock. Inside him, old habits came awake, shoulders low, jaw loose, weight shifted to the left foot. Everything slow, like somebody was teaching him how to open a door for the first time, taking pains to get it right. After a life of opening, closing, leaving, coming back, he learned one plain truth. A door is just a door. What matters is whether the person standing in front of it is gentle enough not to break what's waiting on the other side. A different gust came through, carrying the rare dampness of a desert night, like the steam from a sink when someone's just rinsed the dishes. It didn't last long, but it was enough to spark a tiny memory, a child's hand resting on his wrist, sticky with milk, warm, saying nothing. A memory that didn't want to be named, only to pass through him like a breeze. He let it pass. It didn't make him weak. It just reminded him he once knew how to hold fragile things without dropping them. Ethan turned the key one notch. The sound of metal on metal was soft, like a promise whispered. He stopped, listened. Nothing but the wind playing along the fence. He turned it another notch. The heavy hinge held his movement the way an older hand holds a child's crossing the street. The gate didn't open, just shifted enough for the dark to spill into the crack like ink into a pen nib. He didn't rush. His eyes stayed on the viewing slot, holding that thin space between two worlds. Inside, outside, light, dark, familiar, unknown, returned still lost. That lost feeling wasn't sharp the way it was in those early nights. It had settled into a fixed space, the kind you could set something new into if you were patient. Tonight, maybe that new thing was waiting out there, small but standing tall. He breathed in, his fingertip still resting steady. Above him, the yellow lamp swayed, the halo of light shifting like a scarf pulled by the wind. In his chest, the line he'd carried for so long came back, easy, still here, still able to open, still someone to open for. And when the gate eased another half-inch, Ethan knew that no matter how many shadows the past had thrown over his shoulders, right here, right now, he could still choose a gesture gentle enough to protect a tomorrow. He leaned closer, pressing his eye to the slot, and saw the small shadow move, like a sapling turning toward light. At the edge of the horizon, a thin band of brightness showed. Not dawn, just the city's far-off glow. But it was enough for someone out of place to remind themselves. The road doesn't only run backward into the night. It runs forward, too, in doors that open this slow. The gate shifted another notch, stopping at a gap just wide enough for the yellow light under the awning to spill across, like a strip of cloth laid over the ground. Dust lifted into it, glowing for a moment before settling quiet. In that narrow frame, a small face came up out of the dark, hair matted in clumps, a dry brown streak across the forehead, both cheeks scratched with fine lines like someone had drawn them with a needle. The boy stood straight but leaned a little to one side, as if whatever he was holding was heavy enough to pull his whole body toward the ground. Ethan's light swept lower. A bundle of old cloth came into view, a beige blanket frayed along the edges, a long seam split down one corner, with black scorch marks the size of a hand. The blanket was wrapped into a tight cradle, pressed hard against the child's chest, not a crack of air left between. When Ethan dropped to eye level, knees heavy on the ground, he saw the boy's mouth held shut for a long while, like he was learning to swallow words into his stomach. Then he spoke. The voice was weak, smoke-rough, falling out in pieces and landing cold against the steel of the gate. "My parents are gone, she's burning." The words were short, like a note that breaks in the middle, and then the night closed in behind them. Ethan didn't ask. Didn't ask who, where, or when. Those words wouldn't calm whatever was trembling under that blanket. He peeled off one glove, tucked it into his chest pocket, and set his bare hand on the edge of the cloth. Heat rolled up at once, thick and dry, like the oven's breath just after it shut off. The fabric was coarse, the broken threads scraping his skin with a sound too small to hear. He slid his fingers in, slow as touching a soap bubble about to break. Inside, a hand no bigger than his thumb was curled tight, nails pressing into the palm and leaving shallow white marks. The newborn's lips were cracked, a thin white crust clinging at the corners like dried salt. The eyelids were darkened, lashes stuck together with fine dust that hadn't yet fallen away. When the light passed over, its chest rose and fell like a light door nudged by the wind. Not hurried, but the rhythm of a body spending the last of its strength to keep the motion going. Ethan pressed the inside of his wrist to the baby's forehead. The thin skin there felt the heat rush up. Sweat broke across his wrist instantly. This heat wasn't the desert's. It carried the smell of milk, of smoke, and a faint metallic tang of dried blood. A mix of living and dying. Wind slid through the gate's gap, flicking a pinch of sand into his eyes. He blinked, the reflex tears carrying the grit away, leaving his sight clearer. The boy hadn't moved, but his shoulders began to tremble in tiny bursts, the kind you try to hide by pouring all your strength into your arms. The way he held that blanket spoke louder than crying. No slack, no careless drape, careful to the point of ritual. As if one finger out of place might change the shape of the world under his feet. Ethan set his other hand on the frame, the steel's coldness firming up his decision. He eased the gate another half-inch, careful not to let the hinges sound off. Then he shifted his body and stepped through the gap. Sand crackled under his boots, the sound quickly sinking into the night's muffled layer. He stood in front of the boy, not close enough to take his place in the wind, not far enough to leave the weight without another shoulder to lean toward. One more deep breath to keep his heart from kicking too hard, and he knelt. The cement pushed its chill up through his pants, carrying the stale, damp smell of old paint and dust. From a knee's view, the world settled down, sand rolling in narrow lines, the patch of chipped paint shaped like a bird on the wall, a loose wire swaying without sound. He looked up. The boy met his eyes with a gaze that didn't ask and didn't bargain. In it, the yellow light made a small, bright fleck, like chalk dust floating in a schoolroom early in fall. It stayed still. It didn't go out. Ethan raised both hands, but didn't touch. He left them hanging just above the blanket's edge, giving the boy his choice. The boy studied the space between those hands and the bundle like he was measuring a bridge. 1 second. 2. Then he stepped forward, giving over half a hand's worth of the bundle. The movement made no sound. It was like a door moving after the bottom bolt has been drawn, slow, certain, deliberate. Ethan took it with both arms, setting it into the hollow of his elbow, pulling the blanket tighter against himself to hold the heat in. Under the cloth, a small breath rose against him. Light, but enough to tell him he was holding it right. "It's all right," he said, though it came out no louder than the wind, needing no volume. He tucked the blanket in, fingertips finding a loose thread to fold back inside. As he did, his fingers caught the frayed loop, twisting it into place like an old mother with all the patience in the world. It had been a long time since he'd done something like that, but the body still remembered the way. The boy's arms hung loose now, falling to his sides before coming together in front of his stomach, the reflex of someone suddenly freed of weight. Ethan could feel the cold settling into them through the dust. Bruises lay in layers, some older, some fresh, purple fading under sun-browned skin. On the left wrist, a strip of fabric hung loose, hooked to a small silver trinket, a wing-shaped keychain, shallow grooves etched into it, one edge chipped into a row of tiny teeth. The light caught it, making him look a fraction longer than he meant to. Then he looked away. Now was the time to keep his eyes on that face, not on the thing hanging from the boy's wrist. He stood up slow, holding the bundle closer, and leaned back to widen the door, just enough for 2 small bodies to pass. No need to call anyone else. No need for extra noise. The night could hold a walk like this if you kept the right pace. The boy stepped in behind him, his small feet sinking into the marks left by the larger ones, leaving a row of dimples in the sand, each dimple holding a drop of darkness peeled off the ground. They crossed into the inside, where the light lay still as a shallow pool. Ethan eased the door shut with his shoulder. The hinge let out a tired breath, then went quiet. The low awning wrapped around all 3 of them, pulling the air into a shape you could see. Inside the cabin, the ceiling fan turned slow, each sweep drawing down a single hair's worth of wind toward their faces. On the table, a plastic water jug beaded with cold sweat. Ethan set the bundle on a folding chair covered with a thick blanket. The chair gave a small groan, took the weight, then went still again. He bent over, peeling back a corner to check the newborn's face. The ear was thin as paper petal, one side smudged with soot. A single short hair clung to the forehead, curled like a comma. Commas like that had once made his sentences stretch out, giving the reader time to breathe. Here, it reminded him there was still breath to be had. Ethan lifted the water jug, dripped a few drops onto a thin piece of gauze, and pressed it gently to the cracked lips. No pouring, no rush. Each drop found its way in, vanished, leaving a darker patch behind. His hand stayed there for a count of 7 heartbeats before pulling away. His other arm held out to shield the outside, like the shield of a soldier who didn't want to fight anymore, but still knew where to put his body. Sweat slid at the back of his neck, salty and cool. The boy stood in the doorway, not stepping in, not backing out. He looked around, his eyes taking in everything one piece at a time. The coat hook, the old state map, a black and white photo someone had left behind. He didn't need to know their names. He just needed to know this was a place without fire. In the bottom of his eyes, a different light showed up when he realized that. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just let out a breath that went a little longer. Ethan pulled his second chair and set it opposite the bundle's chair, like 2 banks of a narrow creek. He gave a small nod. The boy stepped in and sat on the edge, feet together like a pair of parentheses. From his middle finger, A grain of sand dropped to the floor, landing in the crack shaped like a tiny tree. Small things like that had their own way of keeping time. No one spoke. What had been said at the gate was enough for one night. The ceiling fan kept the story moving without raising its voice. Ethan checked the clock, then the bundle, then the small face in front of him. He realized just then that a fragile rhythm had been set on the same road. From the gate to the awning, from outside light into this yellow glow, from the hiss of wind through barbed wire to the slow turn of fan blades. Roads like that didn't make maps, but they made a home, at least for the next few hours. He stood again, fitting the bundle into his arm. It didn't weigh much, but the meaning sat heavy as a warm stone. The kind of stone that, set in the right spot, could stop the worst of the water. Go, he told himself, the way you talk to legs that have stood in the wrong place too many times. He stepped forward, shoulder-tipped to keep the bundle out of the draft, and the boy rose with him, his heel clicking soft on the floor. The cabin door opened, and the hallway stretched out like a reel of film waiting for someone to touch it. They passed the line of metal lockers along the wall, a single old cap hanging alone. They passed the glass doorway, reflecting a man carrying something small, and a boy half a step behind. Two shapes overlapping for a blink before pulling apart. They passed the aluminum sign with its letters worn smooth from years of hands brushing past. At each point, the overhead lights slanted down in ovals, pale as rain puddles. Their steps crossed those silent puddles without rippling the surface. At the corner before the stairs, a different smell came up, disinfectant and clean cloth, medicated ointment, the papery scent of fresh files. The air changed texture from sandpaper to fine paper. Ethan felt his shoulders drop half an inch, not from fatigue, but because his body was ready to believe in some kind of care waiting ahead. At the door of the medical room, he paused for half a beat to listen. Inside, there was no rush, only the sound of a pen moving over paper, a syringe shifting in a tray, someone adjusting the height of a desk lamp. He didn't knock. The door wasn't locked. He pushed it with his hip, a motion learned in the days when he carried more than he spoke. The door opened without a sound. The light inside didn't hit hard. It spread like mist, soft, even. The room smelled of cold, clean metal and the warm cotton of gauze. He set the bundle on the bed nearest the window, where the cream-colored curtains stirred in the air-conditioned breeze. The blanket loosened a bit, and the newborn's cracked lips met the cool air the way dry grass meets the first rain of the season. At the corner of its mouth, the white crust melted a little, uncovering a pale pink still holding on. The boy stood at the head of the bed, both hands on the metal rail, his thumbs tracing a strip of chipped paint. He didn't look around anymore. His eyes stayed fixed on one thing, the tiny spot at the edge of the blanket where the newborn's eyelids trembled. That was the only signal he needed. Ethan stood beside him, following his gaze. For the first time that night, he felt his heartbeat fall in his step with another rhythm, one that wasn't his own. Outside the window, the desert was still black, but a faint light flickered far away, maybe the lamp of a truck running through the night, maybe just heat still lifting from the ground. Either way, it was enough to remind a man that darkness isn't solid. It's layered, has depth, and carries pockets of breath. And right here, on this narrow bed, in a room scented with gauze and paper, another pocket of breath had just opened. Ethan tugged his coat around to make a small windbreak beside the bed, keeping the chill from hitting the baby's chest. He looked at the boy and gave a slight nod. The boy didn't nod back. He just tightened his grip on the rail for a moment, then let go, the way someone might test a guitar string before laying a song on it. Notes you couldn't hear, but the body understood. A wall clock moved its hand. The tail of the second hand swept past the same number again, leaving behind a whisper only the sleepless would notice. Ethan checked the blanket's edge again, the rough weave catching against his skin in a way that felt like pencil on heavy paper. He didn't think any clear thought. No promises. Just one small certainty, small enough not to break. Tonight, within the reach of his arms, he could keep these two from falling any farther. And that was enough for part of the night. At the threshold between the hall and the infirmary, their shadows overlapped in the spill of light like the folded pages of a book. On one side, a past not quite shut. On the other, a future not yet written. In the crease between them, a steady breath had been set down. No one named it. No need. It was enough to listen, to know that even after losing your way on a long road, you could find a rhythm again. Not the old one, but a new one, plain and warm enough to carry the night without being swallowed by it. The infirmary light was white enough to look like a sheet stretched tight, all the creases pulled out. Dr. Marin was there, hair tied back, thin nitrile gloves on her hands, her movements as economical as the handwriting of someone who'd been taking notes with an ink pen for decades. She set her palm on the newborn's forehead, then drew it back instantly, as if from a stove still holding heat. The digital thermometer gave a short beep, the number jumping like a silver fish breaking out of a pan. 103.4. Beside it, the heart monitor blinked in time with the imagined flash of a fire truck, and the old ceiling fan swept its thin shadow blades across the ceiling, creaking like a porch chair on an autumn morning. Ethan stepped to the side, still keeping his grip on the blanket, feeling the heat pushing up from that small body like from a pocket-sized coal stove. He backed half a step as Dr. Marin slid her tray of instruments closer. Nothing came in the rush of urgent words. Only the slide of the tray on the stone counter, the tear of gauze, the faint rip of medical tape. She handed Ethan a pad soaked in cool water, tilting her chin in a wordless cue. He understood, laying the pad on the baby's forehead, switching sides every 10 breaths, holding the blanket's corners shut so the heat wouldn't leak away into cold. Noah sat on the far edge of the bed, back not touching the frame, knees pulled tight, arms looped around them. His sand-dusted shoes sat neatly below the chair, laces loose like a sentence without its period. He didn't blink, or if he did, it was so slight the light didn't notice. In his pupils, the curtain's movement in the AC draft turned into ripples small as fingertip waves. He caught the scent of antiseptic, the familiar smell of where people fix things, a smell that sometimes found its way into his mother's kitchen at night when the wind pushed in the dish soap scent. Between those two smells, he sat, unsure which one he belonged to, feeling like both at once. At the table, Dr. Marin opened a small cabinet, took out an 4-bag, reading the label as if looking at an old name. She rolled the tubing between her fingers, set the clamp, passed the needle's tip through the brief blue flame of an alcohol burner, like a small, private prayer. The motion of setting the line into the baby's hand was so clean that time forgot to hesitate. A single drop of clear water fell to the sheet, soaking in like the first rain bead on parched soil. The heart rate on the monitor didn't get louder, but it evened out, just a little more like an old clock just dusted clean. Ethan placed the third pad on Grace's forehead, feeling the heat now softened into a damp warmth with the smell of salt and milk. He noticed his fingers tremble, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar repetition of small, careful movements. Under his jacket, his shoulder blades eased down. On the far wall, a paper calendar hung, turned to a month with no name, the bottom corner curled by the AC's breeze. A dry marker lay still, its tip pointed toward a square already crossed out. The night seemed longer in those objects, but not longer than in the baby's breath. That breath was hard work, but it spoke in a language everyone there understood. Noah shifted his feet, a movement so small the chair didn't make a sound. His soles touched the floor, each toe setting down like someone testing the water. His hands stayed locked over his knees. On his left thumb was a white crack from dryness, and along the nail's edge, a thin black streak, soot or dirt. He watched Dr. Marin move around the bed the way light circles a single point in a camera lens. She didn't ask much. She didn't count what he'd lost. She only counted the drips and the breaths and the steady pulse of the machine. The way she held herself in the room told him there are people who seem born to keep the nothingness from rushing in between a body and its will to stay. The air conditioning brushed past Ethan's neck, carrying the scent of fresh cotton. He remembered a wooden porch step, a porcelain bowl with a leaf-shaped crack, a vase that never had quite enough water. The memories didn't come like waves. They came like a passing beam of light, arriving, glancing off one's surface, leaving behind a faint halo. He picked up the plastic cup from the tray, poured a little water, dipped the gauze, wrung it gently between his fingers, flipped it so the cool side pressed to Grace's forehead. The pulse in his wrist tapped against the gauze's edge, a rhythm just enough to say the man, placing it, had once learned how to quiet himself in places that were too loud. On the windowsill sat a small, round cactus, set just off-center like a stone. 3 white spines caught the light like scraps of snow left on a March hill. In the corner, an old radio sat silent, its antenna folded like the wing of a tired bird. On the shelf, a box of gloves stacked neatly, and a washcloth hung over a metal rail. Things with no owner's name on them. Yet tonight, they stood as allies for a small body still searching for a way to stay. The monitor went pip, pip, the gap between pips closing a little, then holding steady. Dr. Marin adjusted the drip rate, her eyes on the dial, as if listening to a voice from far away. She placed her hand over Grace's chest, not pressing, just feeling the thin lift under the breastbone. Her palm carried a convincing warmth. She pulled the blanket up a little, tucking the lower edge so the tiny legs weren't exposed. Each motion looked too small to matter, but together they moved something heavier than sand. Fear. Noah didn't move, but his eyes left their fixed point, starting to travel the room like a bird looking for a perch. He glanced at the wall clock, saw the second hand cross every fine mark without skipping. He looked down at his shoes, the sand on the toes like fallen stars. He looked at Ethan's hands, the thick knuckles, the faint shine of old calluses. Without meaning to, he loosened one finger, as if testing whether letting go would cause something bad to happen. Nothing did, just the steady beeping of the machine. Ethan slid his chair closer to the bed, sat down, elbows on his thighs, hands resting loose over the blanket. He tilted his head, listening to the way that small body spoke to the room. The pauses, the soft shifts, the circling back. Every night had its conversations like this, wordless but full of meaning. He took a breath, kept half, let it out, kept half. An old lesson. Don't give everything at once. Night needs the pieces you hold back, so morning doesn't feel empty. On the white cabinet, a metal tray caught the light in a line that rolled from one edge to the other as Dr. Marin pushed it gently. She wrote a few lines in the chart. Date, time, temperature, initial response. Her handwriting was small, even like the wooden fence posts lined up in front of suburban porch. Not high, not threatening, just enough to remind you to step lightly. She set the pen down, looking at the two children, one sleeping in borrowed minutes between fevers, one awake with nowhere, certain to set his eyes. She nodded once, the nod of someone seeing a plan that would hold. At the head of the bed, a gooseneck lamp tilted up like a fish's eye. Its yellow light was softer than the ceilings, coating Grace's face in a thin layer of honey. The cracked line of her lips eased a little. Her eyelids fluttered in time with a deeper breath. Ethan switched the gauze, turned it to the dry side, dampened it again, then set it in the exact same place. He heard the drip of water wrung from into the plastic cup. 3 drops, then quiet. 3 was a number he remembered. 3 knocks at the gate, 3 turns of the key, 3 pads in rotation. It didn't mean anything grand, just enough to keep his hands busy and his mind tied to the present. At the foot of the bed, Noah leaned forward, setting one hand on the sheet near the baby's feet, not touching her. The skin was still dusty, with faint blue veins like faded roads on an old map. He kept it there for a long time, like planting a small flag in ground no one claimed, just to remember he'd been there. Then he pulled his hand back, set it in his lap, laced his fingers, and sat up straighter, as if given permission to breathe wider. Dr. Marin rearranged the tray, peeled off her gloves, and washed her hands under the faucet, the sound falling into the sink like a string of glass beads rolling across a dish. She dried them with a paper towel, her hands slowing by exactly 1 beat before resting on Noah's shoulder. Not to comfort him with words, but to lend him the steady warmth of an adult who'd been doing this for years. Her hand stayed there for one short second, then left. He looked up, letting his eyes meet that steadiness, then turned back to the bed. For a moment, the lights in the room flickered, then came right back. The glow bent slightly, like someone giving a small bow, just enough to make everyone wonder if they'd really seen it. Ethan glanced up at the ceiling, an old habit from years of having to account for things outside his lane. But then he lowered his head again, set the gauze in a new spot, as if answering the question. My part right now is this. These kinds of my part are what keep a man in place, even when the hum outside sounds like a storm. The sounds in the room settled into one backdrop. The machine, the fan, the soft hiss of the air vent. No sniffles, no groans. Pain here did its work in silence. And care did, too. Ethan noticed his chest had stopped jumping at every pip. He counted slowly to 10, then stopped, not because 10 was a round number, but because 10 was enough to confirm the fragile things had decided to stay a little longer. Noah blinked, longer than usual. When he opened his eyes again, the strain had eased. He glanced toward the table near the window, where a paper cup printed with stars sat. He stood, walked over, poured some water, and took a small sip like someone testing their voice in their own throat. The cool water woke up a feeling long sealed under dust, the sense that he could still do small things that mattered, keeping his hands clean, sitting still in the right place, not taking someone else's spot in a small room. He carried the cup back, set it on the table. Not flush with the edge, but a deliberate inch back. Just then, Grace's toes curled. Barely. A movement small enough to ripple the sheet like a pond when a tiny fish flips its tail. Ethan and Noah both looked. No one spoke. No need. Only Dr. Marin tilted her head slightly, her hand already resting on the IV's flow dial. Not turning it, just touching it. The way a musician rests a hand on the keys before the song changes. Outside, the desert was still black, but black like a sky with an edge, not the kind of hole with no bottom. A thread of air slipped through the door crack, cool and dry, carrying the smell of sand that had settled. In that smell, Ethan heard grass from somewhere else. Not real, just memory, but one he could trust. He didn't know what morning would bring. A report, an order, or silence. But in this room, he knew one thing was enough to carry the rest of the night. A small body shifting from burning hot to gently warm. A boy learning where to set his hands. An old doctor not asking too much, so as not to wake sorrow that didn't need waking. Those things joined together like frosted glass panes making a window frame. Maybe tomorrow morning, Ethan would be back at the gate, listening to wind tear the wire, thinking about doors that had shut. Maybe he'd feel again like a tenant in his own skin. But right now, in the yellow pool of light and the machine's steady lullaby, he felt a new kind of calm. Not the calm of someone who understood everything, but the calm of someone willing to carry one small action all the way through, repeating it without demanding to see the result right away. Noah sat down again, his back brushing the bed frame for the first time. He let his hands rest open on his lap. His fingers stood like small roadside trees, waiting for the wind to pass without breaking them. He turned toward the window, where the cream-colored curtains still swayed. In that fine sway was a pale line of light. Not dawn, just the reflection of something far off. But it was enough to tell him the road always had a way forward, even if the line was so thin only a child would believe it. Dr. Marin pulled her chair a little closer to Ethan. Not because she had to, but because some distances are worth closing when night sits in the middle of a room with a beeping machine. She set the chart on her lap, pen clipped to the edge, her eyes looking like they weren't focused on anything, when in truth she was listening to the numbers. Somewhere in the compound, a supply cart rolled by and faded. The ceiling fan kept spinning, making the shape of a wheel that would never run over anyone. At the edge of his thoughts, another image slipped in for Ethan. A narrow street in his old town, a low wooden fence, the smell of wet weeds in the morning, a pair of small feet running past, mud splashing onto an adult's calf, a laugh that didn't belong to tonight but had borrowed a corner of this room to rest. He didn't push it out. He let it stay, the way you'd let a lost guest sit on your porch, looking in with wet eyes. After a while, the guest left on their own. The beeps on the monitor even out, no more sudden gaps. Grace was still asleep, but not the sleep of someone chased by fire. It was the sleep of someone just allowed to set down the weight of running. Noah closed his eyes for a second, opened them, and this time looked at Ethan, not to ask, not to plead, just to make sure the man was still there. Ethan gave a slight nod, the kind that didn't promise things would be fine, only that for the hours ahead, these hands wouldn't leave. The night moved like a light boat along the bank. No one rowing, no one calling time. The boat went where the small currents joined. At the far end of the room, the medical waste bin sat closed, round and tight, like a period at the end of a sentence. But the sentence wasn't done. It kept going, out through the window, past the cream curtains sway, across an empty yard, into the sand and fence where the wind had softened. Out there, if someone stood a while, they'd hear something faint, the sound of another day coming closer, on unhurried feet. In the light that hadn't changed, with the fan's steady hum, Ethan set a fresh pad in place, adjusted the corner of the blanket, then let his hands drop and leaned back in the chair. The backrest was hard, uninviting, but it felt good in a strange way. That hardness reminded him he was leaning on something real. Across from him, Noah let his shoulders loosen, lowering both feet to the floor. The cool touch on his soles felt like pressing down on a sheet of paper no one had written on yet. He didn't know what the first word of the morning would be, but the page was there. And maybe, right now, that was enough. The white light still stretched tight as a sheet without a fold, but something in the room had softened. The monitor's rhythm was steadier, Grace's breathing no longer caught at the end. Ethan leaned into the chair for a moment, feeling the ache in his knees like the groan of old porch steps each time someone crossed them. The night stepped back just an inch, enough to give the smallest gestures a place to stand. He glanced at Noah. The boy still sat on the far edge of the bed, shoulders drawn in by a coat far too big, the fabric stiff with dust and soot. At his left wrist, the cloth was worn to threads where it rubbed his skin, showing a thin fabric cord tied loose. Ethan stood, said nothing, and reached out in a short, straight motion, the way someone might hold out a hand to take a rain-soaked coat from a person just in from the storm. Noah understood by instinct, the sense a child gets when a grown-up knows their own strength. He undid each button slowly, clumsily, his fingers cold. When the coat slid from his shoulders, the trapped smell of old smoke and warm sand escaped all at once, brushing Ethan's nose like a small bird striking a window before flying away. Ethan caught the coat, folded it once, and that's when he saw it, a silver keychain, worn and scratched, dangling loosely from a belt loop. It was small enough to ignore, but the ceiling light in the steady turn of the fan caught the metal's edge just right, throwing a thin, pencil-line glint. Ethan shifted slightly, so the light wouldn't change, moved the coat into his other hand, letting his eyes rest on it for one beat. The keychain was shaped like a wing, not a full bird's wing, but the open fan of feathers etched into fine lines, many worn smooth. On the small flat at the base, under a web of scratches, was a mark, not a complete letter, but a mix of line and circle, stamped like an old seal pressed into wrinkled paper. The mark wasn't immediately clear, but familiarity ran through him quick and warm, like holding a winter coffee cup in both hands. He'd seen it somewhere, on the edge of a file folder, in the corner of a label, flashing by on the woven black strap of a rubber watch someone always wore. The memory reached for him like someone standing behind a fence looking into another man's kitchen, seeing the fire but not daring to step in. Ethan left the memory there, uninvited. He looked at the keychain for half a beat more, long enough to make a copy in his mind. Left edge nicked into a sawtooth, round hole stretched to touch where the ring pulled, the silver uneven, light and dark like wind moving over a lake. Then he bent, folded the coat higher to hide it, and, with his other hand, touched the belt loop gently to keep the keychain from tapping against the bed frame. Some things, he'd learned, were best left like a stone underwater. Move them and the water clouds. Tonight's rule was simple. See it, know it, leave it. Noah was now leaning his back more fully against the bed frame, his hands resting on his legs. Streaks of soot on his shins looked like lines someone had scratched quick with a charcoal pencil. He didn't know his coat was neatly folded in the man's hands. He didn't know a small object at his hip had just been named by the light. He only felt his skin cool, his shoulders lighter, the pull at the back of his neck ease, like when someone takes the bag off your shoulder at the doorway. He looked at his sister. One foot was poking out from under the blanket, toes shifting, the second toe longer than the big one by a grain of rice. A detail like that could hold a child still for another 2 hours. Ethan folded the coat neatly over the back of the chair, pulled a clean cotton towel from the cabinet, and held it toward Noah. Not to wipe, just to let him know something soft was within reach. Noah took it, laid it on his lap, and ran his fingertips along the edge the way someone strokes the cover of an old book before opening it. The thin fingers brushing the white weave made a sound so soft it reminded Ethan of the way a woman once hung towels over a kitchen chair, shaking them twice before letting them fall. On the wall, the clock kept moving past its fine lines. The weight of fatigue braided into the start of morning, hiding not in the sky's color, but in the unchanging light of the lamp. Ethan turned back to Grace, changed the pad in the old sequence. Dip, ring, place, count, lift. Each motion linked to the next like bamboo joints, straight without force. He glanced left. Dr. Marin was writing, her shoulders easy, her head tilted, as if listening for something far off. She didn't look their way, but it was as if she always knew where the small gestures were happening. The silver keychain still hung there, quiet as someone asleep on a night train seat, swaying now and then when Noah shifted. Ethan kept it in his side view, the way a mechanic leaves an odd screw at the edge of the bench, not ready to use it, not ready to toss it. The familiar tug ran through him again. Not panic, more like a compass needle slightly off, waiting for a hand to set it straight in an open lot. He remembered marks like that. Not big emblems, but small signs on ordinary things. A stitched circle on a cuff, a diagonal slash on a file clip, the soft imprint under a rubber watch band. To most, decoration. To a few, a signal. Ethan rubbed his forehead where a hat had sat too long and pulled himself back to what mattered now. Water, heat, sleep. The rest, including the mark, could wait until the lights dimmed, until the machine's rhythm changed. until this place stopped being the border between fire and water. Some questions asked too soon send the night off course. Better to keep the answer in your pocket, like a stone with weight, but no tear. Noah stretched a foot, his socks slipping halfway before he pulled it back on. Slow, careful, showing the faint band where the keychain cord had rubbed his skin. Ethan noticed it the way someone sees an old line on tile. Its purpose forgotten, but proof there'd once been a rule. A cooler draft slid under the door, carrying paper, paint, and metal from the hall. The curtain puffed and sank like a mechanical breath. Grace shifted in her sleep, one shoulder sinking, her nose's shadow falling across the sheet like a brush mark. Dr. Marin glanced over, added a small line to the chart, a private notation, the way the keychain was, not for display, for use when the time came. Ethan pulled a spare blanket from the drawer and set it over Noah's shoulders, a weight that kept a body in place. The boy shivered once, then exhaled easier. The keychain tapped the bed frame with a thin ting, sewing another stitch into Ethan's memory. Far out in the desert, maybe on the highway, a truck shifted gears, its low hum slipping into the room and under the machine's pip, pip, giving the night's song another layer. Sounds like that made you feel less alone, even without a touch. Ethan lifted Noah's coat to hang it, dust falling in a small valley on the rubber mat. The keychain swayed again, its scratched symbol neither clearer nor fainter, waiting in its own time. He didn't think of names. Names made things too tight. He thought of shapes, a scarred wrist, a black rubber watch, a weighted step turning left into a room, a fingertip tapping twice before opening a file. Pieces face down, to be turned later. Not now. Now the only word he wanted to write was here, and he wrote it by pouring more water, changing gauze, adjusting the lamp, keeping his spine straight against sleep. Noah curled his legs under the blanket, head leaning lightly against the wall. His eyes closed for half a second, then opened like a window testing its latch. He looked at Ethan, not for words, just for a steady outline. Ethan stood there, his shadow stretched across the floor, cutting the light in two like a temporary bridge. On one side of that bridge was his sister's bed. On the other, the chair he sat in. Even a shadow of a bridge, he knew, was something. Dr. Marin set her pen down, flexing her fingers, joints crackling softly. She glanced at Grace's chart once more, satisfied like a gardener, knowing the soil was ready. No praise, only a quiet adjustment of the lamp, so its light fell gently on the child's face. The silver keychain tapped the bed frame once, a note falling exactly where it belonged. Ethan let it fade into the night's hum, the words still here, settling in his mind. Not as comfort, but as a marker, a place, a task, a sign to be read when morning came. The loneliness didn't vanish. It simply stepped back, leaving space for a steadier breath. Outside, darkness held, but a thin line of light traced the horizon. Illusion or distant patrol, it didn't matter. It was enough for Ethan to ease his shoulders, as if turning forward after a long time. He pulled Noah's blanket to his chest, tucking a corner beneath his chin, careful to leave the keychain undisturbed. Then he sat by Grace's bed, closed his eyes for one breath, and opened them again. The night went on, quiet, unpromising, undemanding. He kept only two things, gauze moist enough and patience thick enough to last until dawn. From his seat, the cold fluorescence washed his skin in pale blue. In the corner, Noah dozed, fingers clutching the blanket's edge. Marin's pencil scratched against forms. The ceiling fan creaked, and somehow that slow rhythm stirred an old layer of memory in Ethan. His gaze dropped to the keychain in his pocket. He'd seen its symbol before, a broken arc, cut deep, traced by his thumb under desert heat. Back then, it had hung from Captain Harlan's desk, catching the light like a blade. Harlan, the perfect soldier, the spotless record, and the rumors no one could prove. Ethan had never tied the fragments together. But now, in the pocket of a boy lost in the desert, the piece refused to be coincidence. He held it, cold against his palm, torn between asking and waiting. He knew a wrong question too soon could close a door forever. Outside, the camp sank into that frozen lake stillness. Inside, Noah's dark eyes met his for a moment, then drifted away. Two people in the same lit room, each guarding a part of the story. Ethan understood then. The keychain wasn't just an object. It was a door to a corridor he'd once walked, one lined with echoes he thought buried. And now, he wasn't sure he'd turn back. Grace was sleeping for real this time. Not the exhausted collapse from an hour ago, but a steady rise and fall in her chest that let the room breathe again. Noah sat on the edge of the opposite bed, the heavy blanket draped over his knees, feet hidden like fish tucked into river grass. His smoke-stained jacket hung neatly in the corner, the fire smell gone, leaving only the faint scent of fabric under lamplight. Ethan waited. He'd learned that questions, if asked too soon, could crack something delicate without making a sound. He swapped the damp cloth on Grace's forehead, dabbed her lips with the corner of a warm towel, then dimmed the overhead light, leaving only the lamp's soft gold, enough for both human eyes and the night to agree on peace. Only then did he pull his chair closer, low enough to meet Noah's gaze. Between them, the floor shone faintly, the curtain's shadow rippling like a shallow lake. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hand lightly on his knee, his voice pitched not to an ear, but to the space between them. "The silver keychain, where'd you get it?" It dropped into the air like dust. No demand, no start or finish, just a door on a well-oiled hinge. Noah didn't look up. He inched the blanket higher, as if lowering an awning before the weather turned. The lamplight caught in his eye, a single bright fleck at the rim, but deeper in it was dark and still, like the bottom of an old well. Ethan said nothing else. In his mind, he could still hear the soft ting from when the keychain had tapped the bed frame earlier, a period at the end of the sentence no one had finished. The answer never came, or maybe it came in another shape. Noah tugged the blanket to his chest like cloth shield, his eyes drifting to Grace's cooler forehead. His fingers flexed and released like moss tasting water. It said enough. Some things needed silence to keep from waking again. At the window, the curtain puffed and fell with a Vince's quiet breath. Ethan eased back in his chair, shoulders dropping out of their guarded stance. He let the pause be. When he finally spoke again, it was softer. "It's okay. We can talk later." It wasn't a way out. It was an unlocked door. Noah didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just pulled the blanket a little higher. The silver keychain stayed where it was, mute under the lamp, its scratched emblem waiting for the right light to show itself again. Ethan knew he wouldn't forget it, but also knew the night didn't need an answer. Not yet. Outside, the dark stayed thick. Inside, there was enough to keep it back. The hum of the machine, the clean scent of gauze, the patience of a grown man who knew sometimes the best thing you can do is wait. Outside, the sky had gone that dull gray you only see in desert afternoons, the kind where the wind starts herding sand into long ribbons across the ground. The infirmary window cast the pale rectangle of an old fluorescent tube onto the floor, tinting everything with a cold edge. Ethan stood in the doorway, his back against the wooden frame, half listening to Dr. Marin while his eyes stayed on Grace. Still, her breathing uneven, like each inhale had to climb over something rough. "We need anti-seizure meds. As soon as possible," Marin said, voice low, as if afraid to puncture the fragile quiet in the room. "But the supply depot says they're out." Those last two words landed in Ethan's head like shell casings on steel, dry, sharp, unmistakable. Out of stock. In a base that always kept 3 months minimum reserves? He'd run logistics before. Stock levels didn't just vanish unless someone made them vanish. He left without another word, boots tapping evenly on the cement floor, steady like a quiet count. The hall to the storage wing was darker than he remembered, one overhead bulb long dead, leaving pockets of shadow that swallowed the light. The air carried not just the sharp tang of disinfectant, but something damp, stale, as if the door had stayed shut far too long. The supply clerk, a thin kid with stiff, fresh uniform shoulders, sprang up when Ethan walked in. The kid tried for neutral, but surprise still flickered in his eyes. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. He just held out his hand. Inventory log. Pages turned with a dry rustle. The anti-seizure meds were listed, full stock. But beneath, in smaller, hurried script, temporarily moved, 1435, yesterday. No destination. No authorizing order. No reason. Just a timestamp. Right in that dead middle stretch of afternoon when the sun was high and no one was looking. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. In the service, he'd learned that not everything missing was lost by accident. Here, things disappeared because someone wanted them gone. He stepped into the storeroom. Shelves neat, labels facing forward, as if untouched. Except the bottom row of the third rack, an empty gap big enough for 2 medium cartons. He crouched, ran a hand along the coldwood edge. The dust was thinner there, as if something had been pulled out recently and not bothered to be covered up. A shipping label lay curled on the shelf, fine sand clinging to the adhesive. Ethan turned it over in his palm. The code matched the missing meds. A thread tugged in his mind. From Noah's silver keychain here, maybe further. Not enough to pin down yet. He kept it in his pocket. The clerk avoided his eyes. Ethan didn't push. Around here, questions only built higher walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, stinging with grit. Down the dirt path to the housing block, Noah sat on the steps alone, a thin blanket around his shoulders. Small against the wide, empty yard, under a sky gone to ash. Ethan thought of himself after discharge, still in uniform, rank stripped, standing in crowds without a place to stand. He should have gone straight back to the infirmary, but his steps slowed. Not just because of the wind. Something in him knew this wasn't only about saving a child. This was going to pull him back into shadows he thought he'd left behind. He drew a long breath, sand and rust in his lungs, and kept walking, each step pressing deeper into a road he hadn't chosen but couldn't turn from. Grace was still waiting for a medicine that wouldn't arrive unless he found the truth. This time, he wasn't letting it go. Captain Harlan's office sat at the end of the second-floor hall, behind tinted windows and half-drawn blinds. Ethan knocked, 3 soft, firm raps. The voice inside was part permission, part challenge. The room smelled of stale smoke and old paper. Harlan sat behind a desk lit from one side, uniform crisp, buttons shining, everything squared to perfection. A man who liked control to look like control. Ethan placed the log on the desk, flipped to the transfer note, and pointed. Harlan glanced down, then up, dismissive. "Cole, you're on duty. Internal supply shifts aren't in your lane." Ethan said nothing. He knew that face, had seen it before alongside the silver emblem etched into Noah's keychain. This case, Harlan's voice cooled. It's an outlier. Not worth reallocating resources. Outlier. In Ethan's mind, it weighed heavier than stone. A newborn seizing for lack of meds, reduced to a line item. He closed the log, left without saluting. The wind was shifting outside, driving grit into window seams. From the balcony, he saw Noah again. Same spot, same blanket, eyes fixed on something far beyond the yard. Ethan knew that gaze. He'd carried it home from patrols half a world away. He turned toward the stairs. Orders didn't mean much now, only boundaries to cross. Back at the infirmary, Marin adjusted Grace's blanket. "Still no meds," she said quietly. Ethan's hand found the shipping label in his pocket, cold, thin, heavy with what it meant. He didn't return to the guard post. Instead, he headed for the auxiliary storage shed, its warped metal door hissing in the wind. No one here to give him permission. Just dust, shadow, and the chance to uncover what stamps and signatures had buried. The silver keychain flashed in his memory, scratches, emblem, the face behind a desk. Pieces were falling in place, but one was still missing. He'd keep going until he found it. Beyond the fence, the desert night was setting in. The base kept moving, voices in the yard, engines from the motor pool. But Ethan felt the ground shift under him, just enough to see the line he had to cross. The tea shop sat just beyond the south wall, where barbed wire gave way to a low brick barrier. Easy to miss unless you knew it was there. The wooden sign was sun-bleached, its lettering worn by years of wind. He parked a few yards from the door. Night had settled, but warm yellow light spilled from inside, softer than anything on base. He breathed in the dry air, touched with the cool hint of early dew. Out here, the military noise faded, replaced by the far-off sweep of wind over dunes. The door opened with a slow hinge squeak. Inside, a handful of low wooden tables, their surfaces polished smooth by years of wiping. Each one held a small copper pot, steam curling up with the scent of fresh mint. The air felt warmer here, like the room itself was keeping a secret from the cold outside. Rafik was behind the counter, shoulders slightly hunched, polishing glass. He looked up at the sound of footsteps and smiled. A slow smile, like someone recognizing a face from long ago. "Ethan Cole," he said, his voice low, still carrying that mix of English and the rhythm of this land. "I figured you'd forgotten the way here." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat at the table near the window. The glass was fogged, and outside all he could make out were the shadows of low shrubs swaying in the wind. He set his cap on the table, rested one hand over the other, and didn't rush to speak. Rafik brought over a fresh pot of tea and poured 2 cups. The smell of mint rose instantly, taking Ethan back to long-ago nights when they sat in a crumbling house on the outskirts of Kabul, sharing boiled water and listening to the far-off crack of gunfire. Back then, Rafik had only been 17, still with some trace of innocence. but already brave enough to guide a squad of American soldiers through streets outsiders wouldn't step into. "What brings you to me?" Rafik asked, straight to the point. Ethan took a sip, the warmth sliding down his throat. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a small slip of paper, a handwritten copy from medical supply log. Just one line, a few clipped words. Temporarily transferred. 1402. No reason given. "You hear anything about a shipment that came through here yesterday?" "Anti-seizure meds." "Large amount." His tone was steady, but his eyes stayed fixed on Rafik's face. Rafik frowned, set his cup down. "Medical supplies?" Ethan nodded. The younger man was silent for a moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Here, anything can disappear. Medicine, fuel, even people." But he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I heard a truck left the base last night, just before dark. Wasn't on the transport schedule. Headed toward the old town, past the night market." Ethan let that sink in, like dropping a stone down a deep well and listening for the thud at the bottom. The old town, narrow winding streets, dead signs, goods changing hands between people who never used their real names. "Want me to look into it?" Rafik asked. Ethan studied him for a long moment. He knew asking meant putting Rafik in danger, but also knew that here, Rafik's network reached corners Ethan couldn't touch. Just find out who was driving and why the meds were leaving the base. Rafik nodded slightly. "It'll take time. Answers don't just fall from the sky here." "As long as we still have time," Ethan said, thinking of Grace burning with fever and how hard it was to keep his calm. A quiet stretch passed. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the glass. Dust seeped in through a gap, mingling with the mint. Ethan stood, leaving a few worn bills on the table. No change. As he stepped out, Rafik called after him. "Cole, be careful. Some roads, once you're on them, there's no way back." Ethan didn't look over his shoulder. He'd known that for a long time, since his first days in country. But this road wasn't leading to some far-off mission. This one led straight back to where he stood, where a child was waiting on medicine to survive. He started the engine, headlights cutting a clean stripe through the sand-heavy dark. On the passenger seat, the supply slip sat damp from his palm. He headed toward the base, but his mind was already mapping a detour, back ways toward that old town Rafik had named. In the rearview mirror, the yellow glow of the tea shop shrank and vanished. All that remained was the night and the plans he hadn't spoken aloud. The shop itself crouched behind a low earth wall, broken bricks stacked as if in a hurry. Fine sand had gathered on the corrugated roof, rolling off in tiny streams whenever the wind passed, like rain falling the wrong way. Warm mint drifted in the air, with a faint trace of herbal smoke and the soft clink of a spoon against a cup. Rafik poured tea slowly, his sun-darkened hands steady, nails trimmed clean. A single yellow bulb swung above them, their shadows long across the tiles. Beyond the window, the last light at the horizon flattened out like pressed copper. They sat across from each other. Ethan kept his coat on, an old habit from years of standing in front of doors that could open into the dark without warning. His cap lay beside a silver keychain shaped like a wing, the tip scuffed and dull like an old scar. Rafik's eyes caught on it for a heartbeat, then dropped back to his tea. Maybe he'd seen that emblem somewhere, in the quiet trades of goods, messages, and wordless glances that needed no explanation. The boy's parents, they had something, Rafik said, voice low, as if a loud word could spill the sound of the spoon in the cup. He didn't call it evidence, just something, the way locals guarded fragile things until they could be named. Ethan nodded faintly, his gaze not on Rafik, but on the dusty glass behind him, where their blurred shapes reflected. He didn't press. Important stories, if pushed, tended to fold in on themselves, like birds just freed from snare. Rafik told him, one late afternoon, not long ago, Noah's mother came by with an old wire basket. Her mint tea was still steaming when she slid a small USB drive in his palm, wrapped in brown cloth, tied with frayed white twine. She hadn't said much, only that if something bad happened, drawing that if, out like a taut string, she wanted it given to someone she could trust. No name. In a place like this, names could drag you under. Ethan listened like a man fitting fragments together, eyes tracing the worn edge of the table where the varnish had peeled into leaf shapes. The silver wing was cold under his hand. He thought of Noah curled up by the hospital bed, of the boy's unblinking stare at the machine's light, of a newborn's dry lips moving like they were searching for breath. The images came slow, without sound, but each one weighted his chest. After the fire, Rafik said. When he went back through the twisting alley to that family's house, the walls were black with soot. The iron door hung off its hinge. A child's bike half burned, handlebars bent in on themselves like knees drawn tight against the flames. His palm was empty. The USB was gone. Fresh footprints marked the dust. A neighbor swore a pickup had stopped fast and left fast, like a cough catching in someone's throat. Rafik hadn't followed. In places like this, chasing often meant running circles around a bottomless hole. Ethan asked what the drive looked like, just once, not pressing. Black plastic shell, silver metal cap. A small chip at the corner like a mouse had bitten it. The twine around it tied in a double knot, common on the West Riverbank, where boats were moored that way. Ethan nodded. He didn't write anything down. If a detail was true enough, it would stick, like sweat soaking into a shirt collar. Silence held for a while. The radio in the shop played an old broadcast, static cutting in and out. Across the room, a server dried glasses with the patient rhythm of someone coaxing a restless child to sleep. Rafik poured in more boiling water. Steam clouded the glass. He stared into it like into a fogged doorway where memories slip in and out. "I'm sorry," he said. Not clear if it was for the woman who'd handed over the drive, or for the child now, without her. "I got home an hour late." And an hour's enough for people who know exactly what they're after. Ethan didn't say, "It's not your fault." He just nudged the cup back toward Rafik, almost too small a gesture to notice. Comforting words, he'd learned, were as fragile as the window pane beside them. Push too hard and they break. And in stories like this, one more break doesn't lighten the load. Rafik spoke of the lists inside that USB, names, routes, schedules, reciting them like a prayer remembered by breath alone. He couldn't be sure of all of it. He'd never opened it. But he remembered the way the woman had held it, her fingers shaking not from fear, but from wanting to place it in the right hands. She said, "If there's someone in the military who still knows how to see." He stopped at see. Ethan understood. Too many eyes had grown tired from orders, forms, head counts. Eyes that looked right through a thing as if through a page folded too many times. Few still stopped and saw it as if for the last time. Outside, a stronger gust pushed two chairs together on the porch, making them knock softly. Sand hissed at the doorframe, like someone tearing a letter. Ethan turned toward it, watching the grit gather in a corner and go still. He thought of the supply room, its neat forms, even rows of numbers so round they felt hollow. He thought of Dr. Marin's hand on the child's forehead, her movements both careful and urgent, like someone trying to strike a fire without burning away the last bit of hope. Rafik said, "I think the USB was gone before I got back." He told Ethan about a man wearing a black rubber strap watch, its round face bulging slightly with a small raised emblem. He'd only seen him from a distance, through the neighbor's window. The man bent over something, maybe a drawer, then left in a hurry, cap pulled low. The movements were quick, but practiced. Not a thief. Someone with a key, or someone who never needed one. Ethan pressed his thumb against the edge of the silver wing, feeling it give a little. It took him back to another kind of memory. Noah in the infirmary that morning, staring at the slow sway of an N4 drip. No questions, just watching. The boy had learned silence fast, like silence was the only thing no one could take. And sometimes, a child's silence saved more than any scream. Could it be? Rafik paused, inhaled. Could they have known the USB's route ahead of time? Ethan lifted his eyes. In distant postings, he'd seen things get ahead of themselves. A shipment leaving the depot before it was signed. A report altered before anyone could read it. He didn't need an answer. Here, the answers often came before the questions. People just didn't want to say the words out loud. The cafe felt emptier. On the counter, a folded damn cloth. The waiter turned the radio down, static melting into the sound of wind outside. Ethan asked the one thing Rafik hadn't explained. "Why did they trust you?" Rafik smiled thinly, the kind of smile afraid to break. "Because I didn't ask too much." He looked at his hands. "And because on the worst days, once, I left a box of milk at their door. Didn't knock." Ethan nodded. Small things like that carried more weight than any oath. He remembered the first time he'd met Rafik. A crowd standing in the sun, jostling for a patch of shade no bigger than a hand. Rafik had let an old woman inside, poured her water, then stepped back without waiting for thanks. Trust wasn't always about words. It was about where you chose to stand. Rafik pulled a crumpled scrap of paper from under the counter, spreading it out on the table. A hand-drawn map of the neighborhood. Side alleys like fish bones, shop names in pencil, the lines uneven. In the corner, a small circle marked where he'd hidden the USB, a short arrow pointing to the burned house. I keep drawing, he said. Helps me remember the roads. Helps me remember what shouldn't be forgotten. Are you scared? Ethan asked, not for the answer, but to remind himself fear needed naming to lose half its grip. Rafik shrugged. Fear comes every morning. By noon, you still have to pour the tea. Ethan let the words settle between them, like tea cooling in the cup. There was no talk of big plans, no wall maps with red pins, no schedules. Just Ethan standing, setting his hat, leaving more than enough for the tea as payment for the time Rafik had spent remembering. And Rafik, resting his hand on the table's edge, thumb pressing and lifting like a man checking if the wood could still hold. Outside, sand curled around Ethan's ankles, dry and cold. He paused under the tin awning, looking toward the base. The barbed wire in the distance was a faint graphite line against the sky. He thought of Noah, of Grace, of Dr. Marin's hand on the empty medicine cabinet. No flare of anger. Anger caught fast and burned out just as quickly. Only a thin, even layer of resolve. And resolve, after enough losses, wasn't loud. It was just a man turning up his collar, facing away from the wind, and walking. Behind him, Rafik called his name. Ethan turned. Rafik held out a scrap of brown cloth, the same kind that had once wrapped the USB. I keep it like a seal, he said, to remind me of what's passed through my hands, and that I can't drop it again. Ethan tucked it into his inner pocket. Small things like that, he knew, helped the man hold on to whatever quiet he had left. The late sun split the porch into gold and pale blue. Ethan's hand slid along the weathered railing, fingers tracing a fine, straight groove, maybe from a knife trimming barbed wire. The wood felt smooth and warm, like thread pulled through fabric until it lost its fray. In a quick flash, he saw Anna's face, not pale in a hospital bed, but smiling on the porch, chalk dust on her hands. A smile without sound, but enough to loosen something in his chest. He turned toward the fence. His job wasn't to shout. It was to stitch the loose pieces together. A silver keychain, a length of wire, a double knot, a pencil arrow on a wrinkled map, an empty cabinet, a boy who knew how to be silent. Put right, those pieces could cover 2 kids on a cold night. Maybe even the guard at the gate, so he wouldn't shiver in the wind. As Ethan left, his shadow stretched down the alley like a single, unbroken line. Rafik stood in the doorway, lifting the bamboo curtain just enough to let the wind pass without snapping the strands. No wave, just a nod deep enough to say, from here on, each would keep his part. One would guard the memory, so it wouldn't vanish again. The other would guard the decision, so it wouldn't soften on the road. Far off, the base lights came on earlier than usual, as if someone remembered night falls fast in the desert. Ethan quickened his step. The grit under his boots sounded dry, compressed. He'd head to the tech room, review the footage, drive one more tack into the stretched canvas of the truth. But first, he let himself slow by a wall, resting a hand on warm brick, reminding himself, some fights are won by small acts. Pouring another cup of tea, tying another knot, rehanging a fallen picture. Behind him, the cafe's small bell chimed once lightly. No one touched it. The wind passed through, leaving the sound like a period at the end of a line. And like every story that has to go on, no one stayed longer than they had to. The wind shifted. His shadow blended into the road toward the fence. In his pocket, the brown cloth pressed against his chest, small, but enough to remind him some things vanish only so we learn to hold tighter to what's left. The tech room sat at the far east end of the compound, away from the drill yard and supply shed. The metal door's paint was peeling, hinges groaning as he pushed in. Inside, the air smelled of dust and burned plastic, the scent any old hand with machines knew. Harsh fluorescent light pooled over benches stacked with drives, cables, and a few battered monitors. A young unit tech, face worn from a long shift, hunched over the console. Empty paper cups and sticky notes littered the desk, a small fan clattering away. He glanced up at Ethan, didn't ask questions, just turned the screen. This is the Northgate camera from that night, the tech said quietly. He clicked the file, grainy infrared footage, desert dust drifting like thin fog. In the corner, Noah appeared, clutching the wrapped bundle, moving slowly, each step measured. From the right, another figure stepped in, tall, sure-footed, practiced. He bent, lifted Noah and the bundle, turned toward the gate. Ethan narrowed his eyes, there the faint glint on the wrist. Dark strap, round face, raised metal emblem. Exactly as Rafik had described. The tech slowed the footage, but as the figure disappeared, the video froze. The last seconds were gone. Not a power loss, but a clean, flat black cut. Deleted manually, the tech muttered, pulling up the access log. The erase command had run at 3:04 a.m., signed off with higher clearance than Ethan's. He stood still, eyes locked on the screen. The tech lowered his voice. If we're lucky, I can pull a few frames. But this stays quiet. Data isn't safe here. Ethan nodded. The kid's fingers flew. The monitor flickered, revealing distorted, grainy stills. Through the noise, the watch's glint was clear, and in the frame's edge, a small pale shine, maybe a silver keychain. The tech saved it to a portable drive, handing it over. Cold metal in Ethan's palm, light but heavy with what it held. He zipped it into his inner pocket. No thanks needed, just a nod to Mark. They now shared the same secret, and its danger. In the corridor, yellow bulbs cast broken stripes along the floor. The drive shifted against his chest with each step, as if reminding him. Someone tried to erase the truth. His job was to make sure it didn't disappear again. At the East Hall's turn, fresh paint met the smell of metal, old fabric, and unworn sun. His shadow met another's, broad-shouldered, unhurried, by an open door marked admin wing. Inside, the sheer curtains stirred without wind, like someone had just passed through. Harlan stood half-turned, one hand on the edge of the wooden table, the other loose at his side, tapping a coaster with 2 fingers. Soft taps, barely there, but enough for Ethan to know this man measured everything. Words, glances, windows, and the silences in between. He didn't look straight at Ethan, just over his shoulder, the warm light softening the lines at his eyes. Ethan stopped a comfortable distance away, close enough to speak low, far enough to keep his breathing his own. Trust isn't always the best armor, Harlan said, like an old saying, flat and even, not meant to be dramatic. The words settled without a sound, but carried a thin wire between them. Ethan didn't answer. By now he knew silence could put things in their place. Harlan bent slowly, picked up a sheet of paper, smoothed it, slid it into a tray. Some things are better left to others, he went on. Nights are long, but some folks know just how long. He didn't ask Ethan about the tech room or the bulge in his coat pocket. He didn't have to. Ethan's hand brushed the pocket, just enough to adjust his coat. In the hall mirror, they were 2 shapes apart, a table between them, a full glass catching the light. Small details, but in nights like this, they felt like bearings. The generator outside hummed low. You wouldn't notice it unless you stood still. Ethan set his cap on a file cabinet. Wind's shifting tonight, he said to himself. Harlan smiled faintly, not with his eyes. Wind shifts when someone's standing in the wrong place. A soldier passed by, arms full of tied-up files, feet quick. When the steps faded, Harlan touched a switch panel, then let it be. Administrative inspections coming. Get more sleep. Tired men make mistakes. The cuff of his shirt slid back, watchband shifting, the face flashing once in the light, just enough to remind Ethan of infrared cameras, of the man carrying Noah, of footage cut clean. You still write things by hand? Harlan asked. Ethan nodded. Good. Paper rarely loses data. But it burns easy, he added. The sound of glass on a coaster was quiet, but the thought carried the smell of ash. Ethan stared at the space between them, a decision forming. I'll report what needs reporting, he said. To the right person. At the right time, Harlan replied. You're not the court. Said soft, it sounded like advice. Ethan nodded, put his cap back on, tilting it just enough to shield his eyes. Passing close, Harlan said low, people mix up kindness and carelessness. Here, once is enough. He walked off, shadows stretching, then breaking in the wind. Ethan stayed a moment, listening to the lights hum. On the table was a new scratch in the wood, straight, sharp, like a blade had drawn it. He touched it lightly. The cold crept into his hand. On the way to his room, he passed the medical wing. Dr. Marin's door was ajar, warm light spilling through. Inside, the sound of a spoon stirring, a page turning, a long breath out. A small cloth swayed on a line like a flag in gentle wind. Little things like that reminded him war wasn't just bullets and orders. It was keeping water warm, a bandage clean, a child's name on a car by the bed. Back in his room, he hung up his coat, checked the hard drive in the inner pocket. Still there. He took out a worn black notebook, switched on the desk lamp, and wrote a few lines. No bullet points, no exclamation marks. Not strong like a punch, but enough to map the distance from the north gate to the tech room, from a cut feed to the glint of a watch. He stopped at 3:04. Not just a time, more like a hook holding the night in place. The wall clock ticked steady, drops into a deep bucket. He stayed like that, upright, until he heard firm footsteps outside. He cracked the curtain. The yard was darker now, a black chair hiding in the shadow of a post, barbed wire stretched to the horizon. The wind was light, smelling of damp metal. He breathed slow, measuring the space between him and whatever was coming. Not a person, but a moment. Closing the curtain, he locked the drawer, covered the notebook with an old newspaper. From tonight on, maybe the small things needed bigger things to hide under. He clipped together 2 pages of a drug inventory, an extra copy he'd printed before losing access. The clip clicked soft, the kind of sound that adds up to a choice. Lights out. The room felt its real size. 1 man, 1 table, 1 shadow. He lay down without taking off his shoes. The generator kept its low rhythm. In the dark, he saw the tech room's doorway, the infrared glow, the cloth bundle in Noah's hands. Harlan's face never showed fully, always at the frame's edge. He thought of a morning far away, his own child laughing at a drawing of a house with a green roof and a single window. That child was gone, but somewhere else, a boy was drawing another house with an open window. Ethan wondered if he could stand at that door long enough for the wind to change without turning cold. Tomorrow, no matter the wind, he'd walk the long hall, past the humming lights, past the black chair in the shadow, to do one small thing. Keep a piece of footage from disappearing again. Somewhere in the base, a door shut without a sound. In nights like this, silence became a shared language. Harlan had said, trust wasn't always the best armor. Ethan understood, but he also knew some armor was made from the opposite, the small things people do for each other without naming them. He touched his chest, feeling the hard drive under his coat. Cold to the touch, but carrying its own kind of warmth, the kind you get once a choice is made. Outside, the wind had shifted. It slid through the sparse trees, pages of some wide ledger turning in the dark. And like every ledger, the next page waited, blank, ready for one quiet line. At the top, 304, last frame missing. Person not gone. A greened up blinked on Ethan's phone. Slow movement on the western edge of the base. Old storage row. Minutes earlier, he'd stood in the infirmary, palm on the edge of a bed, still holding the heat of someone who'd just left. A chair beside it trembled faintly. Not wind, but the ghost of weight. Small prints in the dust ended at the door. No calls, no scuffle, no dropped objects. Nothing, and that nothing made the hair on his neck rise. He looked at Grace's crib. The baby slept fitfully, lips parted. Dr. Marin stood, arms crossed, eyes on the monitor. She lifted her chin when their eyes met. Go. The corridor to the yard was darker than usual, overhead lights buzzing in broken rhythm. Ethan's phone showed the dot pause, then edged toward a door marked B, for abandoned. The west gate latch hung loose. No guard, just a rolled raincoat on the chair. Desert wind carried the smell of hot dust and crushed ryegrass. Storage row loomed like black shipping crates. B4's door was battered, paint curling, lower edge bent in. He stopped under the dull yellow sodium light, glove off, fingertips on cold metal. Under the wind's push, he caught a faint, irregular tick. Nylon against wood, overworked. At the door's base, faint crystal flecks, salt or frayed nylon, and a fresh boot print over an old one. The phone buzzed, signal steady inside B4. Holding the feed, admin wing quiet. Careful. Ethan pressed his cheek to the steel, metallic chill, and old paint bringing back the sound of his parents' feet on kitchen tile when he was a kid. No footsteps here, just a rasp of strap-on skin. The knife slid into the seam. The door lifted inches with a spring's tired groan. He froze, listened, nothing, and rolled in low. Inside, the stink of old oil, rotting cloth, pipe rust. Light died quickly between the leaning racks. He moved slow, knees bent, one hand near the pistol, the other holding the knife. Sand whispered under his boots. Loose nails glittered in a brief sway of the broken overhead lamp. A chair sat ahead, old slapback, white nylon cord cut and frayed over the armrest. Seat depressed from long weight. On the floor, a thumb-sized scrap of gray t-shirt. He pocketed it. A crushed box leaned in a corner, half covered with a peeling silver lightning sticker. Inside, empty except for old zip ties and oiled newspaper. At the bottom, scrawled in black marker, 258/NG. Northgate. He covered it again, set the box back. From deeper in, a faint metal clink. At the rear wall, a small man door, handle rusted, but the lock face worn bright. Pressing his ear to it, he caught uneven breathing, tape rasping over skin. A whisper of air moved, cut off. The phone buzzed. North Hall clear. Weak radio jamming. You have 3 to 5 minutes. Knife ready. He counted 1, 2, 3. Left hand turned the knob. Right hand pushed with the back of his hand. The narrow space smelled of body heat, tape, damp cloth. Light fell across Noah's wide eyes. Hands tied, mouth taped, head tilted. His gaze locked on Ethan's and held. Ethan raised a finger to his lips. The boy nodded, palms flexing like holding a pebble. The tape at his wrists tore easily, but had been applied by someone who knew the habit. The skin underneath was raw. Ethan's hand brushed his thin shoulder, like touching a dry branch. We're leaving, mouthed, no sound. Noah nodded but glanced past Ethan into the dark, as if bracing for noise. Noise came, a key ring, then a metal door opening nearby. Ethan clamped a palm over the boy's mouth, pulled him back behind the narrow door. Through the crack, yellow light leaned in, a figure moved down the aisle, stopped at the empty chair, nudged the cut nylon with a boot. Bent looked around. The watch band on his wrist shifted, dark strap, round face, brief metallic glint. Long, sure fingers and thin gloves. He stood, listening, then turned away into darkness. Ethan counted to 20 before moving. Their steps were slow, soundless, hugging the aisle shadow. At the bay door, the sheet metal fluttered lightly in the wind, rattling against itself. Outside, empty. He slid out first, pulled Noah through. Under the bent awning they paused, letting their ears adjust to open space. The base was still. Ethan's hand pressed the boy's back toward a dirt lane leading behind the storage row, toward a disused fence with a gap big enough for a person. The wind carried the faint ghost of old gunpowder from the range. A short vibration against his leg, his own 3-minute mark. Time to move. He quickened pace without losing the boy. Noah asked nothing, glancing side to side as if he'd learned to keep questions in his eyes. The fence came up behind scrub trees, one dead branch hooking the wire down. Ethan lifted it, pushed Noah through into a narrow court between low walls. No man's land between the storage and barren ground. Here, the wind spun in all directions, grit ticking against the wall like light rain. You tired? Ethan asked softly, each word picked out like a nail from a box. Noah shook his head, touched his wrist where the cord had been. Ethan squeezed it in apology. The boy leaned his head into Ethan's arm for a beat, then stepped away. They moved through blind spots only Ethan knew from past wiring jobs. Twice he froze, once at a lighter flick, once at a conrolling, then still. Whoever might be looking for them was listening, not calling. Ethan gave them nothing. Near the service hall door, he tapped Noah's shoulder 3 times, 3 short runs. The boy nodded, eyes unexpectedly bright. They crossed an open strip to a trash bin, edged along a concrete step, slid under the half-lifted shutter of another shed. 20 heartbeats. Inside, the oily air was almost comforting. Safe for the moment, Ethan crouched to meet Noah's eyes. The boy's stare held steady, threaded through with something wiry and thin, like the twine Ethan had once handled in Rafiq's tea house. He tapped a message to the tech. Got the boy. Signal dirty at B4. Few minutes. To Marin, he sent a single dot, their code for safe enough. Her reply came quick. 1 comma. Received. Outside, the wind shifted again, roof panels chattering like coins in a pocket. Ethan let out a measured breath. The next stretch wouldn't be kind. Someone had their scent now. But for 3 seconds, he let himself hold still, remembering this wasn't about beating anyone. It was about holding a pocket of warmth for 2 kids. Then he opened the door, turning his shoulder to shield Noah from the wind, and stepped into the service corridor toward the tech wing. Noah stayed half a step behind, fingertips brushing Ethan's coat. In nights like this, that touch was stronger than any lock. And even with the darkness still thick, they carried a sliver of light, not from any lamp, but from finding each other in a narrow room that smelled of tape and damp cloth. In places like this, that was enough to keep going. 3 men stood around the boy, blocking every way out. One sat backward on a chair, chin resting on the backrest, eyes lazy but calculating. The tall, thin one spun a folding knife through his fingers, steel flashing quick against the wall. And the third him, the man with the pistol engraved Liberty on the grip, a long scar on his left wrist. Exactly how Noah had described in broken bits over the past days. He didn't rush, just stood angled, one hand loose, the other resting on the gun, as if from habit, not threat. Ethan kept his distance, feet apart for balance on the slick floor, right hand near his holster. Drawing now would be like striking a match in a room full of gas. His eyes moved from Noah to each face, clocking the faint tattoo on one neck, the oil-stained pants of another. The sharp breath Noah took each time the rope bit. Overhead, a single light above the boy swayed, ticking like an old wall clock. Through gaps in the corrugated siding, wind carried the smell of burnt grass from somewhere outside. No one spoke. The silence thickened, enough that Ethan had to control his own breathing to keep from breaking it. A stray cat slipped through a crack in the wall, darting past one man's legs. He flinched, then chuckled, the kind of sound meant to prove control. Ethan knew. Confidence can be the crack to aim at. Noah lifted his head, found Ethan's eyes. Just a flicker, but enough to show more than fear. A thin trust. The dangerous kind, because it demanded you not break it. Ethan shifted his weight, felt the holster against his side. He stayed quiet. In the service, he'd learned that waiting could save more lives than charging. But here, each second risked dragging the boy back toward the hell he'd just escaped. Outside, the wind hammered the siding like hollow drums before a fight. One wrong move, it would blow. He kept his breath slower than the room's tension. They made it out through the service path behind the warehouse. Threading between shallow concrete troughs and pockets of shadow, no camera reached. The tech room door was ajar like a tired eyelid. Inside, fluorescent light pooled cold over the metal table. Dust and burnt plastic hung in the air like a habit. The tech was ready, sleeves rolled, ink on his wrist. He didn't ask where they'd been, just took the hard drive from Ethan like it was a blood sample. The small click it made on the table felt like a new beat starting. The main monitor lit with the satellite uplink. 2 priority channels, 1 backup. He plugged in, green bars flaring then dropping to 2. File list scrolled. The cut video clip recovered frames, a log stamped 304, mismatched drug transfer forms, a scrawled note reading 258/NG, photos of zip ties and the marks on Noah's wrists, Ethan's own handwritten pages under the desk lamp's yellow pool. Go, the tech said, to the machine more than to Ethan. Lines of code flashed and vanished like curtains being drawn. Progress bar, 4%. A lock icon spun slow. Ethan pulled off his gloves, palms flat on the table. He watched the numbers. 9%, 12%, 18%. Every jump loosened a wire inside him. Every pause tightened another. A silent ping on the comms, Dr. Marin's droplet icon. Grace medicated, temperature steady. No words. Wheels rattled in the hall. The tech glanced, kept working. 21%. Another window, second layer encryption. A decoy delay built in. Ethan got it. Sometimes survival was hiding truth in noise. 27%. The glass reflected their backs. 2 silhouettes, a blade of white light between. The tech slid Ethan a plain water bottle. He left it closed. Card reader beeped as Ethan's ID passed, like a fingernail on a cup rim. Bundled packets lined up on screen, time-stamped, signed. 35%. A tube light flickered once, reminding Ethan of that swaying bulb over Noah. Lights in different rooms, different hours, telling the same story. Something worn, still holding. 42%. The tech taped down a spare cable, a ripple in the tape betraying the haste. Details mattered, the order, the rhythm. A tiny ting from the rack, 49%. Halfway, he paused, listening to the fans, then shifted routing for cleaner signal. Ethan thought of Harlan's line. Trust isn't always armor. True, but incomplete. Some nights, all you had was an armor stitched from small axe. A strip of tape, a keystroke, a signature. Not bulletproof, but warm enough for 2 kids. 56%. Slower now. He didn't push. Hurry was noise. A red warning, mild interference. The tech rerouted to a low-orbit pair. On the spectrum graph, a spike dropped like a wave cut before shore. 64%. He flipped open his black notebook to 304, left the page marked. Sometimes an open page was its own reminder. 68%. Footsteps outside. More than one. Work boots, steady. The tech set a screwdriver within reach, not as a weapon, just something solid to hold. The door stayed closed. 71%. A green check marked the drug manifest sent. Restored frames followed. That watch face flare again. Ethan let his eyes move on. 76%. The big system log began its crawl. Fans roared, hot plastic scent rising. Another icon popped from the infirmary, a flower. No real flowers here, but it brightened the room all the same. Ethan set the phone face down. 82%. He locked 2 side ports, encryption layer 3. Shoulders dropped a fraction. 85%. A knock at the door. Light, then again different rhythm. Then nothing. 88%. Ethan shifted to quiet the faint rustle of his jacket. Small sounds could betray. 91%. Data points floated off-screen like stars. Verifying signatures. 93%. Generator hum dipped. Backup battery kicked in. Lights steady again. 96%. A shadow slid past the glass. A soft radio hiss followed. The tech leaned in, body blocking part of the screen. 98%. The bar paused, then moved. 99%. Loki con spoon, slowed. Receiving end acknowledged. Time hung like still air between two doorways. Ethan eased his shoulders, heard the tech's breathing change. Not from fatigue, but from touching the edge of something bigger. A soft ping, like a teacup meeting its saucer. Batch 1 of 3 complete. The bar shifted to the smaller second batch. 12%. He didn't smile, just noted the minute hand crossing 12. One more minute and the knock could return. Or not. Outside, footsteps beat slow and heavy down the hall, pressing into the air. In the small room, lit only by the monitors they worked on, a thin pocket of light pushing truth a little further from where it could vanish. The hot metal smell from the processors bled into the air, mixing with sweat and the dry, stale dust trapped in the wall seams. The room felt like a sealed box. Nothing left but the slow spin of cooling fans and the sound of breathing. Ethan kept his eyes on a monitor, but registered every shift outside, every pulse of air between the door and its frame. The tech swallowed hard, trying to keep his hand steady. Just a few more seconds, he murmured, mostly to himself. The bar hit 98%, then 99%. Outside, a low voice spoke. Couldn't tell who. Sounded like someone telling someone else to wait. The pause that followed stretched, tightening every muscle in Ethan's body. The door shuttered again. Metal clicked, someone working the lock with a tool. Ethan angled his head, scanning for exits. Only this door, and a narrow vent high on the wall. No way out. Then it came, a short, clean ding from the system. Transmission complete flashed bright on the screen, like a travel pass earned after a long, hard run. Ethan exhaled. Not relief exactly, but the breath of a man who knew the most important thing had made out. He gave the tech a small nod. No words needed. Out in the dark, whoever was waiting had maybe heard that tone, but it was too late. The data was already gone, out of reach. Ethan adjusted his stance, gun still in hand. The shadow outside shifted once more, then stepped back and went still. Only the fan hum remained, as if nothing had happened. But he knew this quiet was just the pause before the next wave. One last look at the screen, locking the words in his head. Time to move from holding ground to the next step. Dawn came slow, as if the sun hesitated before lifting over the silver-gray horizon. A thin mist clung to the rear parade ground, where hours earlier there'd been only tired sodium lights and weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete. Ethan stood at his narrow window, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes on that empty stretch. The first sound wasn't wind or an engine far off. It was a faint vibration through the ground, steady, then quickening. 3 black dots emerged against the pale sky. At first, they could have been birds in formation. Then came the rotors, cutting the air, shredding the mist into drifting sheets. 3 helicopters dropped lower, moving in perfect sync. Rotor wash kicked up dust, and the brittle leaves left from last week's storm. Yellow lights swept the yard, flashing off puddles in the concrete. The skids touched with a muffled thump under the engine's low roar. Doors slid open in unison. Dark uniformed figures stepped out, caps low, eyes sweeping for blind spots. No greetings, no announcements, just steady boots and watchful faces. Ethan knew those looks, not here to ask questions, but to confirm answers they'd already settled on. The inspection teams spread in pairs, 2 heading toward the tech block where last night's data had been sent, the rest angling for command. He set his mug down, breathed in fuel fumes laced with wet grass. A sparrow darted up from an old roof line and vanished east, pulling him for a moment into a memory of mornings before war. A radio crackled out in the yard. Orders passed in clipped signals. The helicopters kept their engines running, rotors slowing but never stopping, ready to leave as fast as they'd come. Ethan pulled on his jacket. In the hall, bootsteps closed in. He stepped out, leaving the mug on the sill, its ring of mist fading. The Jeep rolled along the service road behind the barracks, the driver keeping a steady hum in the engine. Ethan sat in the passenger's seat, hands linked, eyes on the track ahead. 100 yards out, the taillights of a small truck flickered and disappeared behind a bend. Nobody needed to say it, Harlan. a load not on the books, taking the side gate instead of the main. The Jeep surged, tires spitting gravel. The side gate came into view, low steel frame, flaking paint, beyond it the narrow road to the highway. Harlan's truck was halfway through when the Jeep cut in. Brakes screamed, engine snarled, and the truck stopped short by a few feet. No one spoke. The wind between the two vehicles was louder than heartbeats. Ethan stepped out, boots hitting dirt with a low thud. His partners fanned wide, rehearsed. Harlan stayed at the wheel, hands resting. His face showed no surprise, just a tighter line to the mouth. His gaze held Ethan's longer than necessary. Heavy silence filled the space. Questions unsaid, answers unwanted. Ethan moved to the driver's side, hand gesturing. Harlan looked down at it, then killed the engine. The quiet after made the faint metallic tremor in the truck's frame stand out. The door opened. Harlan stepped down, boots solid on the ground. Ethan's eyes stayed level with the man's chest, not his face. A teammate came up with handcuffs, metal bright in the early light. No straged, just the chill snap of steel on wrists. Ethan caught his own soft breath as the second cuff clicked home. A gust brought the smell of damp asphalt and machine oil. Somewhere, a crow called low and hoarse. They stood there a moment, all of them aware a line had just been crossed, from days you could pretend into the ones you couldn't. Ethan's hand rested briefly on Harlan's shoulder. Not comfort, not restraint. Harlan tipped his head, as if to speak, then didn't. He climbed into the back of the Jeep, cuffs catching the light. The Jeep pulled away, leaving the truck idle by the roadside. Sun reached lower, touching the wet road. The road to Virginia stretched out in a gray ribbon. Another vehicle had left earlier, carrying Noah and Grace. They passed small towns, stirring awake, bakery ovens steaming, cafe, smoke drifting, neighbors waving. Out there, the world still moved like nothing had happened. Unaware, two people inside the van had just stepped out of danger. The shelter appeared behind a white fence, its faded green gate standing open. Inside, while daisies bloomed in the grass. The red brick building held steady, windows thrown open to the morning air. Grace stepped down first, hair spilling over thin shoulders, holding Noah's hand. For the first time, the boy wasn't looking at the ground. His eyes scanned the playground where kids chased each other, laughter riding the wind. A staffer greeted them with a warm voice, leading them to a small first-floor room, 2 single beds, an old wardrobe, a square wooden table by the window. From there, you could see the garden, bougainvillea climbing the fence, white benches scattered under maples. Ethan set a paper bag on the table, milk, crackers, a green toy truck, a worn picture book, a red rubber ball. Noah stood in the corner, eyes moving from the bag to Ethan. No words, but less guarded. Grace smoothed the bedspread like taming the chaos itself. Outside, kids called each other for hide and seek. The air smelled of damp soil and old timber. Ethan leaned on the doorframe, wind threading through his jacket. He knew this wasn't the fix to everything, but it meant Grace and Noah could sleep without engines or slamming doors. A staffer handed him a slip with contact rules. He folded away, glanced once more at the sunlit garden. Noah rolled the ball in his hands. A small gesture, enough to show the wall between them had shifted. Ethan didn't linger. The door shut softly behind him, leaving the scent of milk and morning light inside. In the kitchen, under soft window light, Noah sat with a pencil, sketching a house with a red roof under a blue sky. Grace clutched a yellow spoon, babbling to herself, tapping the table and laughing. Ethan poured coffee slow into a white cup, steam curling into the sunlight like a thin veil. No one spoke, just pencil on paper, spoon on wood, and the steady drip of coffee. Outside, sparrows and leaves whispered. Noah shaded in yellow windows, then a green yard. He didn't look at Ethan, just checked on Grace now and then, making sure she was still there. And she was spoon-tapping in a room where time, for once, wasn't chasing them. Ethan set his coffee on the table and pulled a chair across from Noah. He didn't say a word about the drawing, just looked at it longer than needed, like he was memorizing it. Then he slid the box of crayons closer. Morning light kept pouring through the window, catching dust motes in the air. They turned slowly, like memories in no rush to land. Breakfast came quiet, toast, butter, strawberry jam. Grace pressed a finger to the jar, leaving a faint print. Noah spread a thin layer on her toast, clumsy but careful. Ethan noticed. When his cup was half empty, he walked to the window. The backyard held wild daisies still wet with dew, a white bench under a maple. A few kids ran along the path, laughter echoing. It was peaceful, so much so he had to remind himself it wouldn't last forever. But today it was theirs. No ceilings, no shadows, no via de escape. Just light, coffee, and the sound of crayons on paper. Noah's drawing was a house. Red roof, yellow windows, green yard. In the corner, two shapes stood together. No faces, just simple forms. Ethan understood. Sometimes silence says enough. Later, Noah handed him another drawing. Same house, but the dark smudge in the corner was gone. In its place, clean space, as if left for light to enter. Three figures stood side by side. One tall, one smaller, one tiny. Lines unbroken. Ethan pinned it to the wall among other kids' art, smoothing the edges. Sunlight hit the yellow window, making it glow. Noah sat back down, choosing sky blue for a fresh page. Grace crawled around his chair, giggling. Ethan remembered the shadows that once took up space in Noah's art. Today they were gone. Not erased, just never there. Outside, wind carried damp earth and wildflower scent. A ball rolled toward the window. Somewhere down the hall, a caseworker's footsteps faded. Ethan leaned against the wall. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it held something words couldn't. Safety, at least for now. Noah passed Grace a pink crayon without hesitation. That, Ethan thought, was something no war, no investigation, no confrontation could teach. A child learning he can share without losing. By afternoon, sunlight slid across the floor. No boots in the hall, no alarms, just leaves at the window and a spoon tapping a cup in the kitchen. Noah dozed off in a chair, Grace curled against him. Ethan's coffee cup left a faint ring on the table. Proof they'd been here. He stood at the doorway, thumb tracing the grain of the frame. Outside, the porch was honey-colored, dusted with pollen. A breeze lifted the tablecloth, laying sunlight across Noah's hand. He opened the door a little, enough for light and the smell of grass, warm laundry, fresh soil. Sometimes you don't have to tear down a wall, just ease a hinge. Back at the table, he marked in his notebook, arrived where I needed to be. Non derline. No exclamation mark. Important things don't need decoration. Noah stirred, dropped a crayon. He glanced at the drawing, reached out, touched the air in front of it, as if feeling something real. Grace shifted, still asleep. Ethan tucked the blanket over them, like a final stitch in a mended cloth. Dust swirled in the window light. He thought about names, numbers, signatures moving through systems like those motes, some settling where someone would notice, some disappearing. But this afternoon, this drawing, this coffee ring, these were certain. On the porch, his shadow stretched over Noah's small shoes, laces neatly tied. Grace's jacket hung, with one sleeve inside out. Little signs that a room had been, and would be, lived in. Someone outside called kids to dinner. Instinct said wake them, but he stopped. There'd be other dinners. Some things need to be left alone, like a young tree in its first day's sun. The door opened another inch. In his head, the voice he used for the dead came back, about long halls, buzzing lights, cold drives, and mornings with no one calling anyone's name. On the wall, the drawing stayed put. Children's colors, placed just right, can make a grown man stand still. Ethan let himself stand still. He knew the world beyond this would keep turning. Files reopened, questions asked, someone seeing truth as a flaw to be painted over. But somewhere someone would look at that flaw in the light and say, this is where we touched. He had no grand words. Just closed the door halfway, leaving enough light for the porch to keep from going dark. And in that thin quiet, a line found its place. Home is where you can tell the truth and still be loved. The last image, the door ajar, the porch swept, the small shoes side by side, the drawing on the wall, two children asleep. The breeze stirred the key on its hook, a soft chime, like a comma at the end of a sentence. And the question left behind wasn't a verdict, but an invitation. In a world that asks for silence too often, would you stay quiet or speak? Some doors opened just enough to let the light in, and just enough to let you know you're not standing alone. After all the long nights, the heavy footsteps, and the journeys with no return date, maybe the most precious thing is finding a place where you can exhale, speak the truth, and still be allowed to stay. If this story brought back a moment, a person, or a place that once gave you that feeling, share it. It might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.